The photograph arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning in March 1998, dropped onto Special Agent Dan Harlow's desk by a courier from the Defense Mapping Agency. It showed a white crescent shape half buried in snow, captured by a Corona reconnaissance satellite during a routine pass over the Alaskan interior 2 weeks earlier. The image had been declassified through standard channels, processed through analog enhancement at Langley, then forwarded to the FBI's Anchorage field office with a terse memo. Possible aircraft debris, grid reference N63-DIG-40, WW151-DIG-42s, recommend ground verification. Harlow held the 8x10 glossy print up to the window light. The resolution was grainy but unmistakable, something manufactured, something that didn't belong in 40 miles of unbroken wilderness. He reached for his desk phone and dialed the number he'd memorized 2 years ago when TransNorth Flight 381 had vanished without a trace between Fairbanks and Anchorage with 18 souls aboard. Before we go further into what that image would reveal, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy deep, real-world investigations that uncover the truth buried beneath years of silence. The disappearance of Flight 381 in February 1996 had been one of those mysteries that consumed everyone who touched it, then slowly released them into uneasy acceptance. The twin-engine Beechcraft 1900D had departed Fairbanks International at 14:22 hours on February 11th under clear skies and light winds. Pilot Marcus Trent, 54, had logged over 9,000 hours. His co-pilot, Jennifer Wade, 31, was known for her meticulous pre-flight checks. 16 passengers, mostly oilfield workers rotating home after 3-week shifts, filled the cabin. The last radio contact came at 14:51 hours. Trent's voice, calm and professional, reported passing over the Susitna River checkpoint at 12,000 feet, 43 minutes from Anchorage approach. Then nothing, no distress call, no emergency locator beacon, no wreckage found despite 6 weeks of intensive aerial search coordinated through Alaska's Rescue Coordination Center. Harlow had worked the case alongside NTSB investigator Claire Voss, a woman whose patience for bureaucratic delays was exactly zero. Together, they'd reviewed every scrap of paper. Maintenance logs showing the aircraft's last inspection 3 days before departure, weather reports confirming VFR conditions along the entire route, passenger manifests revealing no red flags, and fuel calculations indicating adequate reserves. The Beechcraft's emergency locator transmitter had been inspected and certified functional just 2 months earlier. Its absence of signals suggested either catastrophic structural failure that destroyed the unit instantly or something so unexpected the crew never triggered it manually. The search operation had been textbook. Air National Guard helicopters swept grid patterns across 200 square miles of the most likely debris field. Civil Air Patrol volunteers flew low-altitude visual searches. Ground teams on snowmobiles probed accessible valleys. The Alaska State Troopers coordinated with local bush pilots who knew every ridge and creek bed in the region. After 42 days, with winter storms closing in and no evidence recovered, the search was suspended. The families received letters explaining that everything possible had been done. Now, 25 months later, Harlow stared at that satellite photograph and felt the old weight return to his chest. Claire Voss arrived at his office 90 minutes after his call, her parka still dusted with snow from the short walk across the federal building's parking lot. She was 46, with steel-grey hair cut functionally short and eyes that missed nothing. She'd spent 18 years investigating crashes from the NTSB's Western Regional Office, and the Flight 381 case had left her with the particular frustration reserved for mysteries that defied physical law. "Show me," she said, dropping her briefcase beside his desk. Harlow spread the satellite image across his blotter alongside a USGS topographic map marked with the original search boundaries. The coordinates placed the anomaly 38 miles northwest of the flight's designated route, deep in the Hayes Range foothills, where search helicopters had made only cursory passes due to weather constraints and probability calculations. Voss leaned close, pulling a magnifying loupe from her pocket. "That's a stabilizer," she said after 30 seconds of study. "Horizontal stabilizer, still attached to vertical fin. See the angle? That's consistent with a Beechcraft 1900s tail assembly." Harlow nodded slowly. DMA enhanced the image through 3 iterations. Their analyst estimates the debris field spans roughly 200 yards, mostly snow-covered. This piece is the only one prominent enough to register at this resolution. "What's the terrain like?" Harlow traced his finger across the topographic lines. "Ridge slope, eastern exposure, approximately 5,500 feet elevation. Moderate avalanche risk this time of year. Nearest maintained trail is 11 miles south. Nearest road access is 26 miles. Voss straightened, her expression hardening into the focus Harlow recognized from their long weeks 2 years ago. "We need ground verification within 72 hours. If this is 381, we have a narrow window before spring melt obscures everything. After breakup, that whole area becomes inaccessible for months. I've already contacted Alaska Mountain Rescue. They can field a technical team by Thursday morning if weather holds." "Not good enough." Voss reached for his phone without asking. "We need to be on that site. This isn't a body recovery, it's an investigation restart. Every piece of wreckage, every document fragment, every mechanical component tells a story. I'm not trusting that story to second-hand reports." She dialed a number from memory, her tone shifting into the clipped authority she reserved for logistical negotiations. Harlow listened as she arranged helicopter transport through a private contractor based in Talkeetna, confirmed survival gear through an outfitter in Wasilla, and secured temporary field assistance from 2 Alaska State Trooper investigators experienced in winter mountain operations. When she hung up, Harlow asked the question that had been circling his mind since he'd first seen the photograph. Why there? The flight path analysis put them nowhere near that grid reference. Trent was flying a standard commercial corridor following published waypoints. To end up that far off course would require either a navigational error so fundamental it defies belief or something we didn't consider 2 years ago, Voss finished. She pulled a chair close and sat, her hands folded on the desk between them. Marcus Trent wasn't the type to make navigational errors. His record was flawless. But every pilot is human, and humans respond to circumstances. What if circumstances changed after that last radio call? We analyzed the transcript. Nothing indicated distress. Exactly, which means whatever happened fast and without warning, or it happened slowly enough that they thought they could handle it without alarming ATC. Harlow opened a file cabinet and withdrew the thick accordion folder containing his original case notes. Inside were copies of everything. The CVR transcript from previous flights to establish baseline behavior, maintenance records going back 3 years, passenger background checks, weather satellite imagery, and witness statements from the Fairbanks ground crew. He'd reviewed these documents so many times the pages had softened from handling. I keep coming back to the ELT silence, he said, laying out several sheets. That beacon was designed to survive impacts up to 90 Gs. It had a 4-year lithium battery, tested 2 months before the flight. For it not to transmit means either complete destruction of the tail section where it was mounted, or it was already malfunctioning, Voss said quietly, which the inspection wouldn't necessarily catch if the failure was intermittent or hadn't yet manifested. They sat in silence for a moment, the implications settling between them. If the ELT had been compromised, the entire search operation's fundamental assumption that any crash would generate a detectable signal became invalid. The search grids had been designed with that signal in mind, expanding outward from the projected flight path in probability rings. Without it, they'd been searching blind. Would you have made the same call if you'd been in their place, coordinating a search across hundreds of square miles with limited resources and no electronic signature to guide you? Voss pulled the topographic map closer, measuring distances with a ruler and pocket calculator. If they deviated northwest from the Susitna checkpoint, they were flying almost perpendicular to their planned route. That's not a minor correction. That's a deliberate heading change. Question is whether it was intentional or the result of instrument failure. Harlow reached for a secondary file, this one containing technical specifications for the Beechcraft 1900D's navigation systems. The aircraft was equipped with dual VOR receivers, an ADF and a GPS unit. Early model, not like today's integrated systems, but functional for basic positioning. For Trent to fly that far off course without recognizing the error, all three systems would need to fail or provide consistent false readings. Or weather moved in faster than forecast, forcing them to deviate around it. Weather radar showed clear conditions across the entire region that afternoon. Satellite imagery confirmed it. There was a low-pressure system developing to the west, but it wasn't forecast to reach the flight corridor until after 18 hours. Voss made a note on her legal pad, her handwriting precise and vertical. Then we're looking at mechanical failure, instrumentation failure, or human decision-making under circumstances we don't yet understand. The wreckage will tell us which, assuming we can reach it before spring. The helicopter lifted off from Talkeetna at 06:15 Thursday morning under a sky the color of weathered aluminum. Harlow sat beside Voss in the passenger compartment, both of them wearing expedition-weight cold weather gear over insulated flight suits. Behind them, Alaska State Trooper investigators Ryan Mackenzie and Sarah Chen checked equipment. Ice axes, avalanche transceivers, probe poles, a portable VHF radio base station, and 2 weatherproof Pelican cases containing photographic gear and evidence collection supplies. The pilot, a Vietnam veteran named Tom Kellner, who'd flown bush routes for 30 years, kept the Bell 206 at 8,000 feet, following the contours of the Talkeetna Mountains northward. The landscape below was a study in monochrome, white snow covering everything except where black spruce forests clustered in protected valleys and exposed rock faces showed dark grey through the winter accumulation. Kellner's voice crackled through Harlow's headset. Coordinate mark coming up in 5 minutes. Winds gusting to 20 knots from the northeast, so it's going to be sporty. I can give you 1 landing attempt, maybe 2 if conditions hold. After that, we're talking about a fuel reserve problem. Harlow keyed his mic. Understood. What's the nearest safe LZ if the primary site is no-go? There's a bench about half a mile east, elevation 5,200. It'll add 90 minutes to your approach time on foot, but the slope angle's better for a stable landing. Voss leaned forward, studying the terrain through the cockpit windscreen. What about extraction, if weather deteriorates? I'll hold at Talkeetna until you call, but if a storm system moves in, you're looking at 24 to 48 hours before I can safely return. You've got cold weather bivouac gear? We're prepared for 72 hours, if necessary, Chen confirmed from the rear. The helicopter banked east, descending gradually as Kellner lined up on the GPS coordinates provided by the Defense Mapping Agency. Harlow felt his pulse accelerate as the ridge came into view. A long, undulating slope falling away to the north, its surface broken by occasional rock outcrops and stunted vegetation. Then he saw it, a white shape jutting from the snowpack like a ship's sail, exactly where the satellite photograph had indicated. Even from 300 feet, the T-shape of an aircraft tail assembly was unmistakable. Visual contact, Kellner announced, starting approach pattern. The helicopter descended in a careful spiral, Kellner's hands steady on the controls as he compensated for wind shear bouncing off the ridge face. Harlow watched the altimeter unwind, 7,500 feet, 7,000, 6,500, while below them the debris field revealed itself in heartbreaking detail. The main fuselage lay 200 yards upslope from the tail section, its back broken just aft of the wings. The nose had compressed on impact, accordion style, while the passenger cabin remained partially intact, though canted at a 40-degree angle. Both wings had separated, one lying perpendicular to the fuselage, the other nowhere visible, probably buried or carried downslope by avalanche activity. Equipment hatches gaped open, their contents scattered across the snow. "Jesus," Mackenzie breathed, his voice barely audible over the rotor noise. Kellner brought the helicopter into a hover 50 feet above a relatively flat area 60 yards from the nearest wreckage. "This is as close as I can safely put you. Snow's deeper than it looks. You're going to be hip-deep in some places. I see avalanche debris from earlier this season, so move carefully and stay roped together." The landing was firm but controlled. The moment the skids settled, Voss had her harness off and was pushing open the door, cold air flooding the cabin with shocking intensity. Harlow followed her out, his boots sinking into snow that immediately topped his gaiters. The altitude hit him instantly. Thinner air, colder by 20 degrees than Talkeetna, wind cutting through every gap in his clothing. Kellner kept the rotor at idle while they unloaded equipment, then lifted off with a blast of downwash that sent snow devils spiraling across the slope. The sound of the helicopter faded gradually, leaving them in a silence so complete Harlow could hear his own pulse in his ears. Chen pulled out a handheld GPS unit, confirming their position against the topographic map. "We're at N63°14, 3-WW151°41, 8T, elevation 5,460 feet. Debris field extends upslope approximately 210 yards to bearing 315 degrees. Voss was already photographing the scene with a Nikon FM2, shooting from multiple angles to establish spatial relationships. She worked methodically, changing film after 36 exposures and labeling each canister with location and time data recorded in a waterproof notebook. Harlow roped himself to Mackenzie, maintaining 15 feet of separation. Voss and Chen formed a second rope team. They began ascending toward the tail section, probing ahead with poles to test snow depth and stability. The surface was wind-crusted, breaking through occasionally to underlying powder that made each step an exercise in controlled falling. It took 20 minutes to reach the tail assembly. Up close, the damage was even more striking. The vertical stabilizer stood nearly intact, its TransNorth livery still visible beneath a coating of rime ice. The horizontal stabilizers had bent upward on impact but remained attached. Most significantly, the entire assembly had separated cleanly from the fuselage at a structural joint just forward of the pressure bulkhead. Voss circled the wreckage, photographing from every angle, while Harlow documented dimensions and orientation in his field notebook. The tail was canted 12 degrees from vertical, its leading edge facing southwest, consistent with an impact from that direction. The aluminum skin showed tearing patterns that suggested tensile overload rather than compression, meaning the tail had been pulled off rather than crushed. "Here," Mackenzie called from the opposite side. He was crouched near the base of the vertical stabilizer, brushing snow away from a rectangular compartment. "ELT housing." Harlow and Voss reached him simultaneously. The emergency locator transmitter compartment was still secured with its access panel screwed into place. Mackenzie used a multi-tool to remove the screws, his gloved fingers clumsy but persistent. When the panel came free, they all stared at the interior. The ELT was missing. Not destroyed. Missing. The mounting bracket remained intact, its bolt holes empty. The antenna cable hung loose, its connector dangling. Voss's face showed no expression, but Harlow saw her hands tighten on her camera. "Document this exactly as it is," she said quietly. "Multiple angles, with scale reference." Chen pulled a measuring tape and small plastic ruler from her pack, positioning them beside the empty bracket while Voss photographed. Harlow examined the antenna cable, looking for signs of damage or tampering. The connector appeared clean, its threads undamaged. "Last inspection was December 1995, Mackenzie said, checking his notes. "Certified, functional and properly secured." So either it worked itself loose in flight, which would require the bracket bolts to back out against lock washers, or someone removed it, Voss finished. She looked upslope, toward the main wreckage. "Let's see what else we find before we start drawing conclusions." They continued ascending, the slope steepening as they approached the fuselage. The snow here was disturbed by previous avalanche activity, compressed into dense layers that held their weight better but concealed smaller debris. Chen's probe hit something solid every few feet. Pieces of insulation, seat cushions, luggage, all frozen into the snowpack like artifacts in a glacier. The main fuselage lay on its port side, nose pointing downslope. The cockpit had compressed severely, its windscreen shattered and forward instrument panel crushed back into the pilot and co-pilot stations. The cabin roof had buckled upward amidships, creating a jagged opening through which Harlow could see rows of passenger seats still bolted to their tracks. Voss approached the cockpit section first, photographing the external damage before attempting entry. The co-pilot's door hung askew on bent hinges. She pulled it fully open, revealing an interior preserved by 2 years of sub-zero temperatures. Jennifer Wade's body remained strapped into the right seat, her head slumped forward against the control yoke. The impact had been unsurvivable. The instrument panel had crushed her chest and lower body, but her face, visible in profile, showed an expression of concentration rather than terror. Her right hand still gripped the yoke, her left frozen in mid-reach toward the overhead panel. Harlow felt the familiar weight of these moments, the transition from theoretical investigation to human cost. He'd seen enough crash sites to recognize the patterns, the physics of catastrophic deceleration translated into injuries that made sense only when you understood the forces involved. But it never stopped being difficult. Voss photographed the cockpit from the doorway, then carefully climbed inside, her movements constrained by the tight space and need to avoid disturbing anything. She examined the instrument panel, documenting each gauge reading, switch position, and indicator light. Most of the instruments had frozen at their impact positions. Airspeed indicator at 130 knots, altimeter at 5,410 feet, vertical speed indicator showing a 2,000 feet per minute descent. "Engine instruments," she said, and Harlow understood immediately. Both engine temperature gauges showed normal operating range. Both fuel flow indicators registered appropriate consumption. Both tachometers indicated 5,300 RPM, cruise power setting. "They had power at impact," Harlow said, "both engines running normally, which rules out dual engine failure." Voss photographed the throttle quadrant, showing both levers in cruise position. And they weren't in an emergency descent. 130 knots is normal approach speed for this aircraft. They thought they were landing. The implication hung in the cold air between them. Flight 381 hadn't crashed because of mechanical failure or loss of control. It had flown into this mountainside under power at a controlled speed and attitude because the crew believed they were approaching an airport. Mackenzie appeared at the cockpit door, his face pale beneath his balaclava. "You need to see the cabin, now." They followed him to the cabin opening amidships. Inside, the passenger compartment was a frozen tableau of the last seconds before impact. Bodies remained strapped into their seats, positioned in the crash brace position, with heads down and hands gripping ankles. Someone had given them warning. Someone had told them to prepare. But what arrested Harlow's attention was the pattern of the seats themselves. In a normal passenger configuration, the Beechcraft 1900D seated 19, 2 rows of single seats on the port side, 2 rows of double seats to starboard. Here 3 rows of seats had been removed entirely, replaced by cargo netting secured to the seat tracks. The netting had failed on impact, spilling its contents forward into the cockpit breach. Voss climbed into the cabin, stepping carefully between debris. She photographed the modified seating configuration, then turned her attention to the cargo. Most of it was typical oil field equipment, tool cases, spare parts, personal duffel bags. But mixed among the ordinary items were objects that didn't belong on a commercial passenger flight. Chen pulled a metal case from beneath a pile of insulation, brushing away frost to reveal stenciled lettering. Property of North Slope Mining Corp. Confidential. Return if found. Harlow felt pieces clicking into place, the investigation suddenly shifting in a direction they hadn't anticipated. He reached for his radio to contact Kellner, but Voss put a hand on his arm. "Not yet," she said quietly. "Not until we understand what we're looking at." They worked for 3 more hours, documenting everything. Voss photographed, while Harlow and Mackenzie carefully extracted and catalogued items from the cargo netting, recording each object's position and condition. Chen focused on the passenger area, documenting personal effects and checking identification from bodies when possible, work that was grim but necessary. By early afternoon, they had a clear picture of what Flight 381 had become in its final hours. Not just a passenger flight, but an improvised cargo charter carrying mining survey equipment, core samples, and sealed containers labeled with biohazard symbols and handling codes Harlow didn't recognize. The passenger manifest had listed 16 passengers by name and occupation. The bodies in the cabin matched that count. But the cargo they'd been sharing space with suggested a parallel operation, something arranged hastily and off books. Voss assembled her evidence carefully. Photographs of the modified cabin, close-ups of cargo labels, documentation of the missing ELT, and cockpit instrument readings. When she finally sat back in the snow beside the fuselage, her expression was harder than Harlow had ever seen it. "This wasn't a scheduled passenger flight," she said. "This was a charter that got classified as passenger service to avoid cargo documentation requirements. Someone paid TransNorth to fly this equipment out of Fairbanks, probably on short notice, and the airline said yes because they had an empty flight segment and could make extra money. That explains the modified seating," Mackenzie said. "They pulled rows to make cargo space, but kept enough seats to justify filing it as passenger service rather than full cargo, which would trigger different insurance and handling protocols." "And the ELT removal?" Chen asked. Voss stood, brushing snow from her pants. "The ELT removal is about something else. Someone wanted this crash to stay unfound. The question is whether that someone was on the aircraft or whether they arranged things before departure." Harlow's radio crackled to life. Kellner's voice, distant and static-laced. "Field team, be advised weather moving in faster than forecast. I'm looking at a front arriving within 6 hours, bringing heavy snow and 70-knot winds. Recommend extraction within 3 hours if you want a safety margin." Voss keyed her mic. "Acknowledged. We need 90 more minutes to finish documentation." "Copy. I'll start my approach at 15:30 hours. Be ready to load fast." They worked with renewed urgency, finishing the photographic record and collecting specific evidence items. The ELT mounting bracket, cargo container labels, cockpit instrument panel photographs, and personal effects that might help identify the mining company connection. Everything went into labeled evidence bags, recorded in Chen's field log with precise timestamps and location data. At 15:15, Mackenzie called from the upslope edge of the debris field. Got something. Looks like Captain Trent's flight case. The case had been ejected from the cockpit on impact, landing 40 feet upslope. It was a standard pilot's flight bag, black nylon with multiple zippered compartments. Harlow opened it carefully, photographing the contents before removing anything. Inside, Trent's commercial pilot license and medical certificate, a well-worn copy of the Alaska supplement to the Aeronautical Information publication, approach plates for major Alaska airports, a handheld VHF radio with dead batteries, 2 expired Kit Kat bars, and a spiral-bound notebook. The notebook contained Trent's flight logs going back 6 months, handwritten entries recording route, duration, passengers, and any maintenance issues noted. Harlow flipped to February 11, 1996. The entry read, FBK ANC, ETD 1420, 16 packs plus mining cargo, last-minute charter arrangement, Johansson approved, weather CAVU, expecting routine flight. Below that, in different ink, suggesting a later edition, compass erratic passing Susitna CKPT, ADF showing 15-degree deviation, cross-checking GPS, unit frozen, displays flickering, Wade verifying nav by pilotage, proceeding VFR, and then, in handwriting that looked rushed, GPS confirmed failed, both VORs unreliable. Following terrain features to visual approach ANC, ceiling dropping. The entry ended there. Harlow read it twice, then handed the notebook to Voss. She studied the pages in silence, her face unreadable. Navigation system cascade failure, she said finally. Compass malfunction, possibly caused by electromagnetic interference or local magnetic anomaly. GPS failure. That's the first-generation units, known for reliability problems. VOR errors, probably from the same source affecting the compass. By the time they recognized the problem, they'd already deviated from their planned route, and they were trying to navigate visually in degrading weather. But the weather reports were wrong, Voss said flatly. It happens, especially in Alaska where localized systems develop between reporting stations. They flew into cloud cover, lost their visual references, and believed they were approaching Anchorage when they were actually 40 miles northwest in the Hayes Range. The helicopter's rotor noise reached them before they saw it, a distant thudding that grew rapidly louder. Kellner brought the Bell 206 in low and fast, settling onto the landing zone with barely a pause. They loaded equipment quickly, working in practiced silence. As they lifted off, Harlow looked back at the debris field. The tail section stood like a monument, TransNorth's blue and white livery visible for miles. The fuselage lay broken and exposed, its secrets now documented but not yet understood. 18 people had died here because of a sequence of failures, mechanical, procedural, and human, that individually meant nothing but together became catastrophic. The storm front arrived as they passed over Talkeetna, low clouds swallowing the peaks behind them. The investigation restart consumed the next 3 weeks. Harlow and Voss worked from the FBI's Anchorage field office, converting a conference room into an operations center, with topographic maps covering every wall, evidence photographs arranged in sequence, and a growing stack of technical reports from specialists analyzing the recovered materials. The cargo containers proved to be the key that unlocked everything else. The North Slope Mining Corporation was a subsidiary of a larger Canadian conglomerate operating exploration claims across interior Alaska. Through subpoenas and warrant-backed document searches, Harlow traced a payment of $12,000 from North Slope to TransNorth Aviation 3 days before Flight 381's departure, a payment listed in TransNorth's books as charter services, expedited cargo. What made the payment significant was its timing. The mining company had been under pressure from federal regulators to complete an environmental assessment before their operating permits expired on February 15, 1996. They needed geological core samples transported from field sites to analytical labs in Anchorage, but their regular freight contractor had been grounded by an FAA inspection. TransNorth had offered a solution: modify a scheduled passenger flight to carry the samples as supplemental cargo, maximizing revenue on what would otherwise be a routine run with empty seats. The decision was legal but marginal. TransNorth's operations manual permitted limited cargo on passenger flights, but specified that such cargo must be properly documented and secured, that load calculations must account for weight distribution, and that passenger safety could not be compromised. The modifications made to Flight 381, removing 3 rows of seats to create cargo space, pushed the boundaries of those regulations without technically violating them. But the removed ELT suggested something darker. Harlow interviewed TransNorth's Director of Operations, Paul Johansson, in a windowless office at the company's Fairbanks headquarters. Johansson was 62, grey-haired, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades around aircraft. He sat with his hands folded on the desk, his expression carefully neutral. "The charter arrangement was my decision," Johansson said without preamble. "North Slope needed urgent transport. We had a flight segment with available capacity. I authorized Captain Trent to accept the cargo provided it met our weight and balance requirements. Did you authorize removal of passenger seats?" "That modification was within operational parameters. We've done it before on cargo-heavy flights. The seats bolt to standard tracks. You can reconfigure the cabin in 40 minutes. Harlow opened his notebook, finding the entry he needed. "What about the emergency locator transmitter?" Johansson's face didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "The ELT was inspected and certified functional 2 months before the flight. I have the maintenance logs." "I'm not asking about the inspection. I'm asking why it was removed from the aircraft prior to departure." The silence that followed lasted 15 seconds. Johansson's hands remained still on the desk, but Harlow saw the tension in his shoulders. "I don't have any information about ELT removal," Johansson said finally. "Someone removed it between the final inspection and takeoff. Someone with access to the aircraft and knowledge of where the unit was mounted. Someone who knew a missing ELT would compromise any search effort if the flight encountered problems. That's speculation." Harlow placed a photograph on the desk, the empty ELT bracket, properly scaled and documented. "This is evidence, and evidence tells stories. Right now, it's telling me someone at TransNorth knew that Flight was taking risks beyond normal parameters, and they didn't want those risks investigated if something went wrong." Johansson stared at the photograph. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its defensive edge. The mining company was desperate. Their permits were expiring, their financial backers were threatening to pull funding if they didn't complete the environmental assessment. They offered us a premium payment, triple our normal cargo rate, if we could get their samples to Anchorage by February 12th. I told them we'd do it, but only if Marcus Trent agreed to fly the mission. He was our most experienced pilot, someone who could handle any complications. "So you approached Trent personally?" I explained the situation. "He reviewed the cargo manifest, checked the weight calculations, and said he'd do it as a favor to me. We'd worked together for 12 years. I trusted his judgment completely." "And the ELT?" Johansson's hands finally moved, sliding the photograph back across the desk. "That wasn't my decision. 3 days before the flight, I got a call from someone at the mining company. Didn't give a name, just said he was operations coordinator. He asked if our aircraft had ELTs, and I explained they were standard safety equipment. He said the samples they were shipping were radioactive, low-level, naturally occurring isotopes from core drilling, nothing dangerous but subject to tracking requirements. He was concerned an ELT signal, if triggered, would bring rescue teams to the site, and the presence of radioactive materials would trigger hazmat protocols, federal investigations, regulatory delays. He offered an additional $5,000 if we could temporarily disable the ELT for that specific flight. And you agreed. I told him no. Absolutely not. That crosses every safety and legal line. But, Johansson's voice trailed off. But someone else said yes, Harlow finished. Marcus Trent called me the night before the flight, said he'd thought about it, done the risk assessment. The route was simple, weather forecast was excellent, he had nearly 10,000 hours and had never filed an incident report. In his judgment, the ELT was redundant safety equipment that added value only in the unlikely event of catastrophic failure. For a 2-hour flight in perfect conditions, he was willing to fly without it, especially since the additional payment would cover his daughter's college tuition for a semester. The room was silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Harlow could see the weight Johansson had been carrying for 2 years, the knowledge that his decision, or failure to prevent someone else's decision, had led to 18 deaths remaining undiscovered for 25 months. "Did you know about the navigation system problems?" Harlow asked quietly. "What problems?" Harlow showed him Captain Trent's notebook entry, the description of cascading instrument failures. Johansson read it twice, his face gradually draining of color. "No," he said, "Marcus never reported any navigation issues, not before this flight. If he'd indicated problems during pre-flight inspection, I would have grounded the aircraft immediately. Our maintenance protocol is strict on avionics. We don't fly with questionable navigation systems." Then the problems manifested during flight, probably somewhere over the Susitna checkpoint. Which means Trent and Wade faced a situation they hadn't anticipated, deteriorating instruments in what they thought were perfect VFR conditions, giving them enough confidence to continue rather than declare an emergency and request assistance. Johansson set the notebook down carefully. If they'd had the ELT, the search operation would have found them within 72 hours. Even if they'd crashed due to the navigation failures, help would have reached them. Families would have had answers. Because I didn't stop Marcus from removing it, everyone who cared about those 18 people spent 2 years not knowing. Harlow closed his notebook. The confession, while valuable, wasn't legally actionable. The statute of limitations on regulatory violations had passed, and proving criminal negligence required demonstrating knowledge of specific risks that Johansson hadn't possessed at the time. But it provided the narrative closure the investigation needed. "I need the name of the mining company contact who requested the ELT removal." I never got his name. All communications were through North Slope's main office number. Then we'll start there. North Slope Mining Corporation's headquarters occupied a renovated warehouse in Fairbanks Industrial District. Harlow and Voss arrived with a federal warrant compelling production of all communications regarding Flight 381, accompanied by 2 FBI technical agents equipped with document scanning equipment and a mandate to copy every relevant file. The company's operations manager, Richard Calloway, met them in a conference room lined with geological survey maps and core sample displays. He was 48, lean, with the cautious demeanor of someone who'd spent years navigating regulatory environments. "I've reviewed your warrant," Calloway said, sliding a cardboard file box across the table. "These are all documents related to our charter arrangement with TransNorth Aviation in February 1996. The arrangement was standard procurement procedure, approved through our finance and legal departments." Voss opened the box, pulling out folders systematically. Inside were contracts, payment authorizations, cargo manifests, and chain of custody forms for the core samples, all properly documented and signed. Nothing suggested irregularity. Who authorized the specific request to disable the aircraft's emergency locator transmitter? Harlow asked. Calloway's expression didn't change. I'm not aware of any such request. TransNorth's Director of Operations states he received a call from someone at your company, identifying himself as an operations coordinator, requesting ELT removal in exchange for an additional payment. The call came 3 days before the flight. If such a call was made, it wasn't authorized by anyone in my department. Our contract with TransNorth specified standard safety equipment and procedures. We had no reason to request modifications. Voss pulled out a payment ledger, scanning the entries. Your records show 2 payments to TransNorth, $12,000 for the charter service on February 8th and $5,000 listed as supplemental logistics services on February 10th. What were the supplemental services? Calloway leaned forward, examining the ledger. Harlow watched his face carefully, looking for the micro-expressions that indicated recognition or evasion. He saw neither, only genuine confusion. That payment was authorized by our CFO, Martin Krebs. He handles anything outside standard procurement channels. You'd need to ask him directly. Martin Krebs wasn't in the building. According to Calloway, the CFO had left the company in November 1997, citing personal health issues, and had relocated to Seattle. Harlow made a note to follow up, but suspected they'd find nothing useful. Krebs had been insulated by enough time and distance that proving his involvement would be difficult without direct testimony. What they did find, buried in the technical documentation accompanying the core samples, was an explanation for the navigation system failures that had doomed Flight 381. The samples came from a mineral exploration site near Mount Deborah, an area known for high concentrations of magnetite and other ferromagnetic materials. The core samples themselves were intensely magnetic, strong enough to deflect compass needles at distances of several feet. Voss held one of the sealed sample containers against a handheld compass, watching the needle spin wildly. These samples would have been stored in the cabin cargo area, directly below and aft of the cockpit. The cockpit instruments, especially the magnetic compass and VOR receivers, would have been affected by the magnetic field, giving false readings that gradually worsened as the aircraft's heading changed relative to the cargo. Harlow understood immediately. Captain Trent wouldn't have realized the problem until he tried cross-checking his navigation instruments and found they were all giving inconsistent data. By that point, he'd already deviated from his planned route, following a compass heading that was being deflected by the cargo in his own aircraft. And the GPS failure. First-generation portable units had notorious reliability problems in Alaska, especially in winter. Battery performance degraded in cold temperatures, display screens froze, satellite acquisition was marginal at high latitudes. If Trent's GPS unit failed at the same time, his magnetic instruments were showing errors, he'd be left with pilotage, visual navigation by terrain features, which works fine in clear weather but becomes lethal if cloud cover moves in. They compiled the evidence methodically, the cargo documentation showing magnetic samples, laboratory analysis confirming field strength sufficient to affect aircraft compasses at typical cockpit cargo distances, weather reports showing localized cloud formation not captured by area forecasts, and Trent's notebook describing exactly the cascading failures their reconstruction predicted. The National Transportation Safety Board's final report, issued in July 1998, concluded that TransNorth Flight 381 crashed due to a combination of factors: unauthorized removal of the emergency locator transmitter, inadequate risk assessment of cargo magnetic properties, navigation system interference leading to controlled flight into terrain, and localized weather conditions that degraded visual navigation capability. Contributing factors included commercial pressure to complete an expedited charter, inadequate safety oversight of cargo-passenger mixed operations, and pilot decision-making that prioritized mission completion over conservative risk management. The FAA imposed new regulations requiring explicit magnetic field testing for any cargo carried on passenger flights, mandatory ELT functionality checks within 24 hours of departure, and enhanced training for pilots on navigation system cascade failures. TransNorth Aviation underwent restructuring, eventually being absorbed by a larger carrier. North Slope Mining Corporation settled civil suits with the victims' families for undisclosed amounts, then quietly dissolved operations in Alaska. For Harlow and Voss, the closure came not from regulatory actions or legal settlements, but from a cold morning in late May when they returned to the crash site with family members of Flight 381's victims. The snow had melted enough to expose the full debris field, and Alaska Mountain Rescue had established a safe perimeter, allowing access without avalanche risk. They held a brief memorial service on the ridge above the wreckage. 18 names were read aloud, each one followed by silence. Several family members placed photographs and personal mementos in a weatherproof box that would be secured to the tail section as a permanent marker. Afterward, Harlow stood with Jennifer Wade's sister, a woman named Catherine, who'd flown up from Portland for the service. She looked at the mountain peaks surrounding them, her expression distant. "Do you think they knew?" she asked quietly. At the end, did they understand what was happening? Harlow considered lying, offering comfortable certainty instead of probability. But Catherine deserved truth, however incomplete. Captain Trent's flight notes suggest they knew their navigation instruments were unreliable, and they were trying to compensate using visual references. Your sister would have been actively working the problem, cross-checking readings, looking for landmarks. They were flying the aircraft right up to impact. The power settings and airspeed were appropriate for landing approach. I think they believed they were about to land safely. So it was quick. Impact at that speed and angle would have been instantaneous. They wouldn't have suffered. Catherine nodded slowly. Jenny always said flying in Alaska required accepting risks. She loved the challenge, the precision needed to navigate safely through mountains and weather. I just wish... She paused, searching for words. I wish someone hadn't made it harder than it needed to be. That evening, back in Anchorage, Harlow filed his final report and closed the case folder. The investigation had answered the technical questions: how the aircraft had deviated, why the navigation systems failed, what sequence of decisions led to the crash. But the deeper question, the one Catherine had almost voiced, remained. How could professionals have made choices that sacrificed safety for convenience, that removed redundant systems to save money, that convinced themselves the probability of catastrophe was acceptably low? The answer, Harlow knew, wasn't dramatic or simple. It was the accumulation of small compromises, each one justified by circumstance and rationalized as acceptable risk. Captain Trent hadn't been reckless. He'd been confident in his skills and experience, confident enough to believe he could compensate for missing safety equipment. Paul Johansson hadn't been negligent. He'd trusted a pilot's professional judgment rather than enforcing rigid rules. The mining company hadn't been malicious. They'd simply prioritized business necessity over abstract safety margins. And 18 people had died because those small compromises, each one individually defensible, had converged into catastrophe. Voss found him staring at the closed file folder, the case number written in precise block letters on the tab. She set 2 cups of coffee on the desk, taking the chair across from him. "You did good work," she said. Clean investigation, solid evidence, clear conclusions. The families have answers, the regulations will prevent similar accidents, and the responsible parties faced appropriate consequences. Did they? Harlow asked. Johansson kept his job. Krebs retired comfortably to Seattle. TransNorth's executives got golden parachutes when the company was acquired. The only people who paid the full price were the ones who had no say in the decisions. That's true of most accidents. The people who create risk rarely bear the full consequences, but that doesn't make the investigation meaningless. Every regulation we've helped create, every safety protocol that came from this case, represents lives saved in the future. That has to be enough. Harlow sipped his coffee, staring at the darkening window. Outside, Anchorage was settling into summer's endless twilight, the sun hanging near the horizon in perpetual golden hour. I keep thinking about the satellite photograph, he said. That image was taken 2 weeks before we even knew the wreckage was there. It had been lying in that exact spot for 2 years, waiting to be found, while we searched everywhere else. All because someone removed a radio beacon that cost $300 and weighed 4 pounds. That one decision delayed discovery, prevented potential survivors from being rescued, and left families in limbo for 25 months. How do you assign appropriate consequences for that? You don't, Voss said quietly. You document what happened. You learn from it. You try to prevent it from happening again. That's what investigators do. We don't deliver justice, we deliver truth. Justice is someone else's job. They sat in silence, watching the light fade slowly from the sky. Somewhere in the Hayes Range, Flight 381's wreckage would remain until nature reclaimed it completely, slowly disintegrating into rust and aluminum oxide, returning to the mountain that had claimed it. The investigation was closed, the reports filed, the lessons catalogued for future aviators to study and remember. But for Harlow, one question remained. Had it been enough? Had the investigation provided the kind of closure that transformed tragedy into meaning, or was it simply documentation of failure, a detailed accounting of how reasonable people made unreasonable choices? He thought about Catherine Wade, standing beside her sister's broken aircraft, asking if Jenny had understood what was happening. The truth was more complicated than yes or no. Jenny Wade had understood the risks inherent in Alaska bush flying. She'd trained for emergencies, practiced forced landings, studied survival procedures. She'd done everything a professional could do to prepare for the unexpected. What she couldn't have anticipated was that the unexpected would come not from weather or mechanical failure, but from a deliberate decision to remove safety equipment for commercial convenience. That her instruments would fail, not through malfunction, but through interference from cargo loaded into her own aircraft. That she'd spent her final minutes trying to navigate by landmarks while flying through clouds, believing she was approaching an airport when she was actually 40 miles from help, descending toward terrain that would kill her instantly. Would you have made different choices if you'd been in their position? The operations manager balancing safety against profit, the pilot weighing risk against reward, the executive authorizing payments without asking detailed questions. These weren't hypothetical questions. They were the fundamental challenges of any system where human judgment mediates between competing priorities, and the only honest answer was, maybe, but probably not. Because every person involved in Flight 381's final mission had been operating within the bounds of normal professional practice, making decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, accepting risks that appeared manageable until they weren't. If you appreciate real investigations like this one, stories that honor the complexity of human decision-making while demanding accountability for choices that cost lives, subscribe and stay curious, because the truth we seek isn't simple, but it's always worth pursuing. Harlow closed the file folder and placed it in the cabinet drawer designated for completed cases. The metal drawer slid shut with a hollow sound that felt appropriately final. 25 months of questions had been answered. 18 families had received closure. The system had been improved, however incrementally, by lessons written in tragedy. But as he locked the cabinet and gathered his jacket, Harlow knew that some questions would never have satisfactory answers. Questions about how much safety was enough, about where reasonable risk became reckless gamble, about whether any investigation could truly honor the dead by preventing similar deaths in the future. The only certainty was this: Flight 381's story would be studied in aviation safety courses, referenced in regulatory discussions, and remembered by those who understood that every accident was preventable in hindsight, but maddeningly difficult to anticipate in the moment. Voss stood at the window, silhouetted against the twilight. "You ready to go home?" "Yeah," Harlow said. "I'm ready." They walked out together, leaving the closed case behind them, carrying forward only the knowledge that truth, however difficult, was always worth the search.